Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
And welcome back, everybody. I am gratified that more and more of us are taking a deeper look at ourselves, our mental health. Yes, I said mental health. If I said that 20 years ago, people would be looking at me like, something's up over there. But many of us are totally okay with going to a therapist. In fact, if you don't have a therapist, it's kind of the reverse now. People kind of look at you like, well, the life is really good, or maybe you need one. One thing we're going to talk about today that has been supporting lots of people, and that is ketamine. Now, it's got a history, and its use today to help support our mental health is very different than its use back in the day. We're going to learn about that, dispel some of the myths, and she's the woman behind Revitalist, and that's a leading mental health company. And ketamine is in her wheelhouse. Katie Walker is with us. How you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. And before we get into ketamine, tell me about your company, the things you support, how you help people.
Now I've made this company around need. So really I've learned kind of what I have a lot of skill sets, but one of them that's kind of unique is that if there's a need, I have the brain that can help build the service line to help to bring, things to people. So it's called translational medicine, but that's kind of what we're doing at Revitalist. It's like we do all the normal stuff with ketamine and looking at the brain and looking at depression, but really anything that we see is in society, like that's not being there, we're trying to bring that in. And really, we're just disrupting the entire system. And that's what I've been doing with this company since 2018.
Love it. I envision it's like a rock thrown in a pond and the ripples come out. And one of those ripples is ketamine.
Yep.
So, um, I don't even know where to begin because it's got a history. It got some perception. It was, used for a number of different things. Maybe we should start with the history.
Sure. Yeah. So one of my degrees is in anesthesia, and we
Oh,
know,
wow, there you go.
yeah. So I know ketamine pretty well. We get pretty
Wow.
granular. But so yeah, so I'll give you, a brief summary because we could talk about ketamine for a long time. But ketamine's 54 years old, right? It's an FDA approved medication for 54 years. So
Mm,
take from the time you're born until the time you're 54 years old, you're going to have a few times in life to where maybe your reputation may be skewed a little bit, So she's been around for a really long time.
wow.
But what ketamine was actually created for, and this is, a fascinating piece, I think, is back before ketamine, anesthetic drugs were either explosive, cause seizures, or they cause liver failure. So when you see older hospitals that have operating rooms off to the side, it's because what we were using to put you to sleep was explosive. Like we had to turn off that certain gas to put you to sleep to put you on another gas. But that's why a lot of ORs are at the top of the hospitals or off to the side. So what
Hmm.
they started noticing is there's a drug called PCP, also known as angel dust, that it actually had anesthetic-like qualities, but side effects kind of high. So they took PCP back to the lab, and lo and behold, ketamine was born back in the 1960s, and it was FDA approved in 1970. So it's the only dissociative anesthetic. That's actually the term for it. And now if you look at ketamine and you look at this other drug that's up and coming called psilocybin, they actually have
Hmm.
very similar anesthetic-like qualities. So psilocybin is actually great for pain reduction with a lot of, really treatment-resistant pain conditions. But ketamine first utilized in Vietnam as a battlefield anesthetic. And then the 80s, it started being used with veterinarian medicine. So you'll hear a lot of people say,
Hmm.
oh, that's a horse tranquilizer, that's
Yeah.
cat Valium. And the reason it is because ketamine has a huge safety index. So that means it's really, really hard to mess it up. So you can take, a rodent and you can overdose that little rodent on ketamine and it's still going to be okay. You're not going to kill it. Same with a tiger, same with an elephant. The reason it's a horse tranquilizer is because they can actually give horses enough ketamine to get them to stand still while they do whatever needs to be done. And the beautiful thing about ketamine is it doesn't change your respirations and it doesn't change your heart rate like the other medications do out there that cause sedation. So it's very, very safe. So ketamine's actually been on the World Health Organization's list of essential medications, which is a huge accomplishment because of its safety index. Every country in the world has access to ketamine. So, so we've used it. Everybody saw its safety. Then it started being used. It's called Special K in the clubs, to where people will use it kind of as like an anxiolytic, something that like decreases anxiety, kind of makes you feel like you're, taking a benzodiazepine, Xanax or Klonopin or something like that. There are people out there that do abuse ketamine. The abuse of ketamine,
People abuse alcohol.
they abuse toilet paper. I
Yeah.
mean, like let's go back to COVID when everybody's buying all their toilet paper, right? That was actually a comfort. It was a crowdsourcing thing for comfort when everybody's buying all the toilet paper. But yeah, anybody will abuse anything. But the ketamine doesn't work the same way as abuse like it does with other things that are addictive. So when you take ketamine, your body doesn't need more ketamine like it does with opiates. Ketamine puts you into a neutral state. And this is where we start to see a lot of this regeneration that starts to come about. The brain can naturally regenerate if we put it in the right conditions. So ketamine, it helps us to feel neutral. It allows the brain to regenerate. But if we don't take the steps to break the old that's making us to get to these negative patterns anyway, then we're going to just turn to ketamine because it just gives us a moment of peace, a moment of feeling like we're neutral. So the one of the neat things with ketamine is in the late 1990s, the way that ketamine causes the brain to regenerate was by Yale University, and it was an accidental finding. They were trying to actually discover a treatment for schizophrenia with rodents, and they were giving these rodents huge doses of ketamine. And the little rodents started becoming less depressed. So they've really taken off with that. Since the late 1990s, ketamine has been used in this context for mental health and pain. And what we're seeing now is when you can make the brain neutral, it can disconnect from old patterns that are causing us to trigger, that are causing us to cycle. All mental health, you are not a depressed person for your entire life. Your depression gets worse, it gets better. Anxiety gets worse, it gets better. All of our mood is cyclical. And that's what we forget about. We think we get sick and we've got to manage it. We're seeing people with ketamine and psychedelics go into remission of their symptoms. And that's something the mental health space, most of them still don't believe that you can go into remission of your symptoms. And that's what we're seeing is actually happening. So yeah, it's groundbreaking, revolutionary, like anything that you want to say, this is going to change everything. But also what happens in the States, especially when we get really excited about everything, we get out there and we just do it. She said it's safe. She said it's safe. You're going to go into remission. I'm going to do it myself. No, don't do that, because just because it's safer doesn't mean that there's still side effects or adverse events. Mind you, the whole Matthew Perry piece, like that entire situation is a horrible situation.
It's, when you look at, and now the information came out that there could be people charged with it. They were giving him massive amounts. He was asking for it. They delivered it. They weren't qualified to administer it. So yes, that's an isolated situation that you never want to walk down that road.
It's horrible, and I've heard, I mean, the autopsy report came out, and unfortunately with Matthew Perry too, he had other substances, in his body. So Suboxone, benzodiazepines, things that actually do work with ketamine to make it even stronger,
Right.
and then, it's just all the bad steps. And the poor guy, he trusted the wrong people
Yes.
around him. And that happens, right? That happens in the mental health space so much. And that's why, my background, like, I'm trained in psychiatry as well, but my background more specifically is neurology. And that's the beautiful thing that we're seeing with ketamine and psychedelics is it's not about psychology, it's not about psychiatry, it's not about physiology, it's about all of it. And what it's doing is it's allowing us to see patterns and those patterns are duplicated, which means that it's science. So mental health, instead of it being all these theories that we're guessing on, it's becoming real. And it's, and now the way you think, the way I think, they're all going to be different because we've been exposed to different environments and cultures and all these different things. Yes, that's different, but the structure is what's consistent. So a lot of times with ketamine, what we do, and psychedelics as well, if you look at your brain as a computer, and you see data, right? Like that's what I do is the brain duplicates what it knows. It's muscle memory, and I always ask people like, do you believe in muscle memory? And everybody's like, oh yeah, I believe in muscle memory. I'm like, well, here's a fun fact. Your muscles actually don't have memory. It's your brain that remembers what the physical aspects are doing. The brain also remembers the behavioral aspects. So what saved you previously is going to be a pattern that you'll duplicate in the present time if you feel that there's a threat. And I like to talk about threats and vulnerability because I hate both of those terms. And that's why I think I like to talk about them because they're so misunderstood. When you're out, and this is an analogy I like to use, it's like, say I drop you off in the middle of the Congo. You have no money, you have no friends, you have nowhere to go. You are then in a vulnerable position, meaning that you are in a state of being out of control. The brain matches, it's just like physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if you feel out of control, your brain's going to try to over control the situation in order to balance it. So vulnerability, anytime that we get triggered, quote unquote, it's because we feel out of control and we reacted to protect ourselves.
I was going to bring up that point or ask you about it, that our brains, subconscious, all of it, it just wants to protect us. It wants to keep us safe. But sometimes it does things to overcompensate to get that done.
That's right. And there's a statistic because I've been around like 15,000 people with ketamine. Initially, I came out and I was like, I do anesthesia. I know what I'm talking about. And then I went back to my psychiatry degree.
Hmm.
But I sat there and I would look at people. I'm like, what is going on with your brain? Like, what is this? And that was when we were starting to able to identify patterns. And we actually came up with a really fascinating scale that's been validated now with almost 12,000 people. But it's 5 questions. And it's 5 questions and it gives you, it's like an R ring, right? But it's giving you insight on what your brain's doing. It gives you a score. That's all it does. 0 to 100, 0 bad, 100 good. Here's your score for the day. And it's 5 questions.
I want to get to that at some point during these podcasts. So we're going to table that, but keep that on our radar because I'm
Oh,
fascinated with the 5 questions.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Well, because the
Uh,
brain, right? Here's the thing with the brain is it's so beautiful because it's so complex. But unfortunately, the complexity, like to every complex pattern or complex situation, there's a pattern. There's like a key. And unfortunately, mental health, we've not looked at the brain necessarily as complex, but we put it in a category as being eccentric to where it's like, oh, it's going to do what it's going to do. And that's not true. Everyone follows a pattern, but it's really, really hard to see what that is. Now, when you get them under the ketamine, the psychedelic space, you got the right people around, it slows down enough to where we can kind of identify what those patterns are. And a statistic that I saw, which just made life make so much more sense, is you've got conscious and you got subconscious or your unconscious, right? Which is your gut, your reactions. 5% of the decisions that we make in life are based on conscious thought. 95% is based on your subconscious. So I'll tell people like your conscious actions are your they're actions, right? Your subconscious is your reactions. So it's like when you go to like, what are you going to wear today? That's your conscious thoughts. And then, why did I react when I smelled that flower? That's your subconscious. So if we can start respecting the subconscious more and not looking at ourselves like we're crazy, because that's what we do, right? Then we can learn to grow from that. So an example that I use is, and this is why psychotherapy doesn't work a lot of times, because we're consciously analyzing everything. We're not diving in and accepting it. We're trying to make it more pathological, which is not pathological. We just need to understand it better. But I tell people all the time with the subconscious that the subconscious is stupid, simple, strong, right? It's so simple. We can't consciously dumb ourselves down enough to see what it's doing. So say we go to the grocery store and say we see a tomato. And all of a sudden we see the tomato and we're going to have a panic attack over this tomato. So consciously we go, well, I'm losing my mind because I'm staring at a tomato, like getting ready to lose my crap. Or I need more medications, or I need to get back in therapy, or, or I finally lost it, right? Like that's our conscious analyzation as to why we're looking at this tomato. Whereas the subconscious goes so simple, it goes to our senses. The subconscious may see red, green in a circle. And the subconscious may go back to when you were sitting in front of a red light and that red light turned green and somebody hit you in the back and you were in a car wreck. So the subconscious may have looked at that little tomato as a threat because of the colors in the circle.
You went deep there.
Right,
Because
huh?
I thought it was going to go back to, when you were 7 years old, somebody threw a tomato, hit you in the face, and you were like, ah.
Yeah.
But it could
Yeah.
be. It could be.
Who knows, right? So I tell people it's like you go in with intentions, you go in with goals, and then you give us the stars and we'll help you make the constellations. But sometimes you're so close to that environment, you can't see it. You need a little bit more space. And unfortunately, what we're doing right now, and I was thinking about this earlier today, what we do, say if I went through a divorce and say all of a sudden, like I'm depressed or I'm anxious, what are we going to do in the mental health space? We're going to look at you and say, oh, you're basically a failure to thrive. And here's some medications to get you to feel better, right? We're not looking at that person as, well, you were married for 25 years. That marriage was part of your identity. Your identity is now changed and shifted. And we've got to help you to rebuild that new identity where you are now because you feel lost. And there's nothing about sickness that's associated with that, but that's the way that we view it. And
100
that's
billion percent. And then that's a great example. And there's a lot of things that come along with that example:
Mhm.
fear of abandonment, being alone, starting your life over, finances. That would freak anybody out, even the most mentally
It's
healthy person.
normal.
It's normal, right?
Yeah. And that's what we got to do. That's why I get so frustrated. Like I
Yeah.
love speaking to all the different specialties because that like I worked in the ICU for 10 years. So I spoke to specialties there and then I worked in the OR for 10 years. So I spoke with the specialties there. So, I can sit down with a researcher or a neurologist or an obstetrician or a pediatrician and understand, like I understand their languages better. But what we've got to do in society, we've got to stop being fear adverse because we're so afraid of stepping in to help someone because we're afraid that they're going to come back and they're going to either sue us or say we hurt them or something like or come after our families.
Mm.
And so providers they're scared to death to help right now. And it's very, very unfortunate. And I mean, look, we need to disrupt the entire system, right?
Yeah.
And
But but
I'm
it's
I'm
but
in
it's
for it.
easier to say, here, take this as a provider, and
Right,
well,
because it's
good.
quote unquote FDA approved. And that's, the other thing there. So FDA approved. So people know this because I'm working on all it's communication barriers. But FDA approved, yes, it's been FDA approved for a certain indication. If you are on an antidepressant and an anxiolytic or an anti-anxiety medication, you are now taking medications off label. So people don't understand almost 98% of all medications in the mental health space are prescribed in an off-label capacity.
Define that off label.
So off-label, so to be on label, FDA likes to look at one situation for one drug, right? So say with MDMA, which recently got shut down by the FDA, not because the data wasn't good, it just wasn't packaged correctly. But MDMA, they were looking at MDMA for PTSD. So one diagnosis, one drug. And they were trying to get it on label to where it would say MDA has been approved for PTSD. So that's the on-label capacity. Off-label is when we see that there's benefits and there's supporting research behind it that shows that there's benefits of a substance for a condition. But in order for it to be on label, the cost is usually about $100 million of studies that you have to do for the FDA to approve it. So this is why ketamine, when people say, well, why isn't there more stuff with ketamine? Well, ketamine is so old, nobody can own ketamine. It's too old. So when I say that, nobody wants to put in $100 million for the studies because they can't get their $100 million back when it becomes a trade drug. So if you talk about trade
Wow.
drugs versus generic drugs, when new medications come out all over the commercial, it's because the pharmaceutical companies are trying to get their money back from all the trials that they've done, plus trying to make profit. So when you see that, it's still the trade name. As soon as that drug goes to generic, anybody can use it. Anybody can make it, and you stop seeing the commercials. There's no more money in it. So that's why with ketamine, there's no money in ketamine. There is a drug called Spravato.
What's it called again?
Spravato. It's Spravato. And Spravato is, so each drug has a right side and a left side, and they mirror each other. The people at Janssen, which is a baby company to Johnson and Johnson, were smart enough to see these breakthroughs that Yale was having in the late 1990s, and they started work on a drug called Spravato, which is the left side of ketamine only. And they got it patented in 2013, I think is when it went live. And
Wow.
Spravato is going to be the biggest revenue driving drug that any pharmaceutical company's ever seen.
You know, to your point here, I have minor skin cancer, been dealing with it forever. You know, pieces pop up, I take care of it. And late 1990s, I was on a medication, a cream that reduces skin cancer. Just you put it on, makes it all crusty, like 5 weeks, boop, goes away. It wasn't FDA approved for that use. It was approved, and the doctor, he's since retired, very progressive, cool guy, love him. It was genital wart cream.
Oh,
So when I would go to the pharmacy, it's like, it's not what you guys think. It's for
So
something
look at-
else. And putting on my face, it's even weirder. But it became a thing. It was approved by the FDA. And then to your point, it went to generic. You never hear of it. It's still widely used. I'll be using it probably in 3 weeks. Get a little thing, whatever. But yeah, the off-label use doesn't mean you can't be using it. It's just different.
And typically insurance companies won't cover it because it's off label. But providers get afraid that if I use it off label, I'm going to get sued.
Right.
And then, and people get afraid, well, if they're giving it to me off label, like I'm at higher risk. And that none of that is necessarily true. And you have to just know how to look at peer-reviewed data and what the results show and different things like that. And a lot of times the funds just aren't there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating talking about this. We're almost out of time. I seriously want to get into the 5 questions next time we get together, and also what a ketamine session feels like, what it
Yeah.
looks like, what you experience, because there's some things that I think we need to talk about there in that regard. If anybody wants to learn more about what you do, your company, Katie, how do they do that?
So one thing they can do, the website is the best place to go. So revitalist.com. It's revitalist.com. I also have a podcast to where we talk about everything, right? I guess because that's what needs to happen. But we talk about everything mental health. And you can find that. That one's called Rethink with Revitalist. But then also, if people really want to get granular, I have a website, katherinewalker.com. And literally, it's me sitting there talking to the camera for like an hour on PTSD, depression, veterans, adolescents, and talking about how ketamine specifically targets those audiences. So it can give, a little bit more insight to that.
Wow, a lot of insight today. Validated a lot of things I thought, suspected. I had no idea your background. Final question. Yeah, like there are some people that administer ketamine, and that's all good as long as they're qualified. You are like layers deeper. Psilocybin, you mentioned that before, and a lot of times that is associated with mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Is it or not?
Psilocybin is part of mushrooms, yes.
It is. Okay.
Yes. So psilocybin is a substance that comes from mushrooms, but actually it's something called psilocin that is actually the active product from psilocybin. So yeah, if you want to look at psilocybin studies, Johns Hopkins doing a ton of great stuff. They have a ton of great people over there, and they're actually recruiting a lot of people right now for their psilocybin trials. A lot of really cool ones they're doing.
Love talking with you. You make it so clear to understand. You don't get too clinical, but there is research and experience behind you. Fantastic. Katie, great talking to you. Thanks for being here. I'm truly looking forward next time we get together.
Well, thank you so much. Me too.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.